Now, once you have the DNS Server service installed, the next thing to do is configure DNS Server, and to do so you really need to understand something about the roles that a DNS server can play in the DNS hierarchy. And there are basically three types of roles: primary, secondary, and caching only. These roles are really determined by what type of zones are created, stored, and managed on the DNS server. Remember, earlier in Chapter 1 we talked about what a zone is. The zone is actually the physical part of DNS. They actually hold the resource records that resolve names to IP addresses, or in the case of a reverse lookup zone, IP addresses to names. One of the roles that a DNS server can play is a primary server role. A primary DNS server stores a writable copy of the zone information, of the resource records. There are actually two types of primary zones that you can create: standard primary zones and Active Directory integrated zones. A standard primary zone stores the information in a text file, and you can manage this text file manually if you want to, or you can just use the MMC console. Active Directory integrated integrates the zone information into Active Directory information. So that is replicated amongst domain controllers. So therefore, really, that single Active Directory integrated zone file is stored on lots of different servers. But typically, when you're talking about a primary, you think about a standard primary zone. And to show you what I mean here, let's take a look at a domain space, beanlake.com. We create a beanlake.com zone, and we're going to designate this server as the primary DNS server. And that means it's going to store a zone file, and then every time we add a computer to the domain, a resource record to the domain, those records are going to be added here and here only. This is the only place where the zone information can be modified at the primary level. Now the other kind of role, one of the other kind of roles, is a secondary DNS role. Now why would you implement a secondary zone? Normally for the reason you implement secondaries of anything else: load balancing, fault tolerance. A secondary DNS server stores a read-only copy of the zone information. In this domain, if you had thousands of users, you might want to load balance the DNS queries. So you might want to implement, if this is our primary server, this might be a secondary server. And here is a copy. So we get the information that's stored in this zone file from the primary zone. When we create the secondary zone, we also have to specify where the master records are coming from. You have to specify a master zone. That information can come from either a primary or a secondary server. And that is a little confusing, but there is a difference between a master server and a primary server. For example, if we also implement a secondary server here, the information in the zone file can be a copy of a copy. So here's the primary server. Any change that's made is made here. This is also the master server for the secondary zone. This other secondary server, its master is this secondary. So secondary can be a master, a primary can be a master. And of course, when you implement your first secondary server, you're going to have to specify a primary as the master zone file. The third kind of role that a DNS server can play is a caching-only server. And a caching-only server exists only to resolve DNS queries. It's not authoritative for any part of the DNS hierarchy. To install and configure a caching-only server, all you have to do is install DNS. So right now I have a caching-only server. If we configure clients to ask the Bean server for name resolution, then it will go and it will try to resolve those queries. How does it do that? It starts to walk the DNS tree, and it can do that because it's already configured with, if we look at the properties, root hints. This is part of the DNS installation with Server 2003. So we can ask this DNS server, hey, what's the IP address for yahoo.com? And it will try to resolve it, and will be successful because it knows how to start looking through the root levels of the DNS hierarchy. It can perform these iterative queries. After it's done resolving, then it caches that information and keeps it handy, and then it can resolve other queries for the same information from the cache. In fact, when you're dialed into your ISP and get your DNS server, or if you've got your DNS server from a cable modem or DSL, chances are that the DNS server you're configured with is a caching-only server. It only resolves queries and then keeps them handy in a local memory so that it can hopefully resolve queries more quickly than walking the DNS tree. So these are the 3 server roles: primary, secondary, caching only. And you configure these different types of server roles by deciding which kind of zone files you're going to create. And we talk about the actual creation process of the zones in the next module.